Greetings to you all. Welcome to our first podcast under the topical episode. And I'm very happy to have my colleague and friend, Professor Mark Swilling, for this episode. To give a brief introduction about Mark, Professor Mark Swilling is a distinguished South African political economist with a specialization on sustainable development and just and sustainable transition. He currently holds the South African Research Chair in Urban Innovations at the Center for Sustainability Transitions at Stellenbosch University. He is also a commissioner on the National Planning Commission in the Office of the President, Republic of South Africa, and a member of the board of the National Transmission Company of South Africa. Professor Swilling has published widely on urban social movements, governance, urban theory, urbanization in Africa, energy transitions in the global south, sustainability, state capture, and more recently on financing transitions. His most recent books are The Age of Sustainability, Just Transitions in a Complex World, and 1985, The Langa Massacre and the Ending of White Rule in South Africa. Mark and myself known each other through our publications in the area of sustainability and sustainable development for decades. But the first time we met was in 2014 at a regional urban forum in Kigali, Rwanda. And since then, we have worked on a number of projects together, including publishing a book on transformational infrastructure and other regional reports that were commissioned by various regional entities. So I'm very happy to have Mark as my first guest, and our focus would be mainly on just and sustainability transition and its relevance for Africa. But before going into that part of our discussion, while I was reading his latest book on the Langa Massacre, which is a very fascinating reading, I made a quotation of this part in his introduction, which says, "The stories captured in this book are both specific to South Africa and of general relevance to the many who now face the challenge of confronting authoritarian regimes in an increasing number of countries across the developed and developing world." So my question to you, Mark, is that what triggered the publication of this book at this point in time, and what do you mean by what you stated in your introduction, which I just read to you?
Well, thank you, Desta, and it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here on your first podcast. I think we all know that around the world there is a rising authoritarian nationalist movement that is translating into electoral victories. And most of those authoritarian movements in the global north, in North America and Europe, across Europe, tend to have a strong racist bias, a white supremacy bias. But there are authoritarian movements elsewhere in the world, like in Argentina, El Salvador, Brazil under Bolsonaro, and many others. And as a result of this rise in authoritarianism, there is an increasing number of activists who are organizing in ways to resist these authoritarian movements and these authoritarian governments. And as I have met more and more of them across the world as I travel, many ask the question, what can be learned from the South African experience? Because after all, the South African experience during the 1980s is actually of movements rising up against an authoritarian, militarized state, which was an apartheid state. Um, and there was a transition to democracy that was not preceded by a violent civil war or mass killings like one saw in Chile in 1973 and Indonesia before that. We didn't have that. There was a mass uprising that dislodged a very powerful militarized state, not because the democratic movement had guns and armies, but had the legitimacy and support of the people and international support that made it possible to then have a negotiated settlement. And I felt it was necessary to tell the story. And I focused on the year 1985 because it was the year when the balance of forces shifted in favor of the mass democratic movement, the internal mass democratic movements, and the external liberation movements. And the key moment was 21st March 1985, which was the commemoration of Sharpeville Day. And Sharpeville shootings took place in 1960. On the 21st of March, 63 people shot in the back, followed by a shift in the balance of forces in favor of the regime. And so 25 years later, the opposite happens. There's a shift in the balance of forces in favor of the democratic movements and the liberation movements, resulting in Mandela walking out of prison 5 years later, and elections 4 years after that, first non-racial democratic elections 4 years after that. So I wanted to tell the story to say it wasn't just about international isolation, a bit of armed struggle, and a great leader like Nelson Mandela. It was the actions and sacrifices and bravery of tens of thousands of grassroots activists. And, so that's the message to activists around the world.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, most of us have heard about Soweto, Sharpeville, and the other major incidents, but this is the first time I was able to read about the Langa massacre, and it is very insightful. And I would encourage everybody to grab this book and read through it, because it provides a very, very valuable insight, particularly at the moment where we are in, from the global political dynamics perspective. So with that, we go into our first question. As a person who has worked for decades in the area of just and sustainable transition, what does it mean to you in its most practical sense, particularly in the context of Africa's development desire? Mark.
Well, at the most simple level, the just energy transition is really, in the African context, about a low carbon development pathway. We don't talk about decarbonization in the African context because we haven't got a well-developed carbon-intensive infrastructure. So we need a low carbon development pathway, which also addresses our development needs. In other words, achieves justice and not just a lower carbon traditional mode of development. So that's the essence of what a just energy transition is in the African context. But there are a number of different players who have different interpretations of what that means. So I think there are four. The first one is a just transition focused exclusively on decarbonization. This is from within the South African context, where decarbonization makes sense in order to catalyze economic growth as quickly as possible. And this is articulated mainly by the banks in South Africa, but I've seen it elsewhere as well. namely phasing out fossil fuels is good for economic growth. And if there's economic growth, there will be trickle down and the poor will benefit. So that's the one. The other is a decarbonization or a low carbon development pathway with welfare interventions to mitigate the negative impacts on coal workers or coal communities or workers associated with oil, gas, and coal production. So it's a kind of welfarist intervention coupled to low carbon. The third is where low carbon development is seen as a catalyst for green industrialization, which is essentially the argument you and I made in the Economic Report for Africa 2024, I think it was, called A Just and Sustainable Transition. And that's where that's official government policy now in South Africa is renewable energy as the driver, or the energy transition as a driver of green industrialization. But many government departments and international donors are still in the welfarist paradigm. And then there's a fourth paradigm, which is articulated by trade unions and radical NGOs, who essentially say that you can't have a just transition under capitalism. So a just transition is a post-capitalist possibility. In other words, a shift in the balance of economic power is required as a precondition. So those are the four ways in which it is used. And I think the third framing is the most useful because it really does address the need for an inclusive green industrialization that can be driven by an energy transition or a low carbon development pathway.
Yeah, I think the most important distinction, even if each of them come from different dimension, when it comes to the third option, which we also promoted through our various reports and publications, is that what Africa needs, not only Africa, even other developing countries need to do, is to follow a different development pathway that has the renewable energy development as the backbone of the whole energy system. It's not about excluding the others. African countries can still develop their non-renewable resources in order to facilitate their economic development, but they need to invest more on the renewable energy potential they have while they are exploiting and utilizing the other energy resources to drive a more sustainable and just economic development within the region. And this is possible, particularly when you couple it with the large mineral resource that Africa has, including the critical minerals. If African countries can couple the renewable energy development strategy with their mineral resource development strategy, then they will have a very strong basis to promote higher economic development that could benefit or promote well-being also at every level. So perhaps related to this, based on your experience, what are the major institutional barriers for African countries to move on this development track? Because they have all the possibilities, most of them, and the knowledge is out there, but there is still a lot of resistance or barriers to make that transition, both from global and continental and national dimensions. From your perspective, what are these critical barriers that we need to overcome to put African countries on this development track? Mark.
Well, I think the first set of barriers is cognitive. We don't realize our potential. So we have all the radiation resources needed for massive solar generation. We have all the wind resources for massive wind generation. We have massive adaptation resources in our forests and our soils and our wetlands. And we have the critical minerals as well as the non-critical minerals that are required to build the infrastructures. And we also think we don't have the money.
Yeah.
And we assume that this is all very well, but somebody else must give us the money. But FDI is in decline, ODA is in decline. So we have to look at our own resources, and we're going to come to that discussion. So I would say the key institutional barriers is reflected in the following facts, which is you have plenty of money for projects in Africa, and you have plenty of need, but you have a limited number of projects. And that is a reflection of weak capacity to collaborate, to develop the kinds of projects that can be funded, whether it's grant funding or concessional funding, or even commercial funding. So we need a massive increase in the project pipeline, given that not all projects are funded. So you have to have far more projects than actually do get funded, and we actually have the opposite. There's more funding available than projects, and that's a reflection of institutional weakness. And I think if you go down to it in a little bit more detail, the key leader ranges in building pipeline should be the development finance institutions. And we have 122 DFIs on the African continent. Some of the big ones are well known: African Development Bank, African Finance Corporation, Development Bank of South Africa, and others. But most of them are relatively small and weak, and act as transmission belts for projects designed elsewhere and implemented in Africa via DFIs. And DFIs have to change that. DFIs have to become the leader ranges of a whole bunch of collaborations between the growing number of pension funds, the expanding African banks, the various institutional investors, in order to kind of start bringing together projects and finances in a way that can actually make an impact. So I think that's a big issue. And then I think a third issue is the fact that the large majority of FDI that does come into Africa is actually going into fossil fuels. So as we speak, there's an international conference happening in Santa Maria in Colombia around phasing out oil, phasing out fossil fuels, because fossil fuels were not mentioned in the statement that came out of the last COP in Brazil. And so these countries, led by Colombia and the Netherlands, have brought 50 countries together to say, we're no longer going to be dominated by the oil-driven countries like the USA. We're actually going to start phasing out. And Africa needs to read the writing on the wall. They might take comfort from the fact that there's a president in the White House who talks about drill, baby, drill, and that's good news for African oil. But it's short term. The long term, we have to look at the long term and build the institutional capacity for a low carbon development pathway.
Yeah. Talking about the financing issue. I mean, we have been dealing and addressing the issue of the need to reform the international financial architecture, which has gained some pace at various levels, although we are yet to see the concrete outcome from all the activities and the deliberations. But I know that you recently led a process which looked at the African financial institutional structure itself, what kind of capacity we have within the African context, and what kind of change we need to make in terms of expanding the fiscal space for each of the African countries. And what are the key outcomes from this exercise you have led, and what do you foresee in terms of the leadership role that needs to be taken by regional development banks, starting from the African Development Bank up to the sub-regional development banks? Mark.
Yeah, so I think we're going to look back in 10 years' time on the year 2025, and we're going to say that was the year when the narrative fundamentally shifted, and there was a realization that the fundamental obstacle to the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted in 2015, 10 years later, we recognize actually the fundamental obstacle is the architecture of the global financial system. This was really articulated most clearly, actually, in the Nairobi Declaration that came out of the Africa Climate Summit in 2023, but has been articulated by many others since then. The Bridgetown Initiative, led by Prime Minister Barbados, the Secretary General of the UN has been talking about the need to reform the global financial system. And then the Finance for Development Summit that took place in Seville in June last year also clearly, formalized that it's necessary to reform the global financial system. Now, this is easier said than done, because obviously there's a lot of vested interests at play, and the global financial system actually revolves around the petrodollar. So because oil meets 60% of our energy requirements, and it is traded in dollars, and the US makes sure that it continues to be traded in dollars, that really works well for the American system, which is heavily dependent on massive quantities of debt. The only reason that's possible is that every time you and I put petrol in our cars, we are transferring dollars into the US economy. And that's how the petrodollar economy works. But the war in the Middle East is actually bringing that to an end. Venezuela started trading oil in non-dollars. Iran started trading oil in non-dollars. The Chinese have started buying oil in non-dollars. And this is all a threat to the global petrodollar system. So Venezuela's president was kidnapped. Iran was invaded by a joint Israeli-US Air Force. And there are other countries under similar threats. But with the biggest oil consumer in the world bombing the biggest oil infrastructures in the world and pushing up the oil prices through the roof, that's accelerating the energy transition. And the countries meeting in Colombia at the moment are all basically saying we have to accelerate the energy transition now because we have no option, given the oil price. And that is going to start meaning that the global energy system moves off the petrodollar, and more oil gets traded in non-dollars. And so what we are seeing is the breakup of the old financial petrodollar-based financial ecosystem. So that's one way of thinking about all of this. But the other way is to think about it is the Brazilian presidency of the G20 and the South African presidency of the G20 both gave considerable emphasis to what are called country platforms. So country platforms are, if you like, just transition frameworks that are authored by the countries themselves, and not crafted by the international financial institutions or aid agencies. And so there's quite a number of country platforms in existence: Egypt, Senegal, South Africa, Vietnam, Colombia, Brazil, and in Africa there are 4 more being formulated: Nigeria, Rwanda, Ethiopia. I think the 4th one is Ghana, or maybe it's Malawi. I've forgotten. And these 4 countries, plus the ones that already have country platforms, are essentially drafting frameworks for saying the people of a particular country and our government and our experts are drafting our priorities and our ways of managing the energy transition. What's missing in many of those country platforms is a financial framework. To say not just to quantify how much is needed, but also how to mobilize. And that's what I've been doing. That's the work I've been doing. So I did a report for our National Planning Commission in the presidency, where we analyzed the architecture of the South African financial ecosystem and then identified the pools of capital that are available, not just via monetary policy or fiscal policy, but via a multiplicity of interlocking balance sheets that could be unlocked could be unlocked to release capital for investment in the just transition. And we're now doing that same work for Senegal, because Senegal has got a big oil and gas boom, but they're in a debt crisis. And, so they are a perfect example of a country actually with capital, which needs to be redirected to plan for and invest in their own just transition. So that's how I see the kind of global and country level perspective dynamics.
Thank you for sharing your insights and experience with our audience, and I'm sure we'll continue this discussion in the coming weeks and months. Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you.